Hello everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. On a warm summer evening in Brooklyn, Iowa, the sun was setting over endless fields of corn and soybeans that stretched to the horizon. It was July 18, 2018, and the small town of about 1,500 people was experiencing the kind of peaceful summer night that residents had come to expect. Children played in their yards, neighbors waved to each other from porches, and the gentle breeze carried the sweet smell of freshly cut grass through lined with modest homes and white picket fences. Brooklyn, Iowa, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. It was a community where people left their doors unlocked, where high school football games were the biggest events of the fall, and where the most exciting news usually involved the local harvest festival or a new business opening on Main Street. Crime was virtually non-existent. Violent crime was unheard of. This was a town where parents didn't worry when their children went for evening walks, where joggers felt safe running alone on rural roads, and where the greatest danger seemed to be the occasional aggressive dog or a deer darting across the highway. In a modest home on the edge of town, 20-year-old Molly Tibbetts was preparing for her evening jog. She had been dog-sitting for her boyfriend, Dong Jack, who was out of town for work. The house belonged to Dalton's brother, and Molly had been staying there to take care of the dogs while the family was away. It was a routine she'd done many times before. She was comfortable there, safe there. In a town where she'd grown up and where everyone knew her name, Molly was a vibrant young woman with her whole life ahead of her. At 20 years old, she stood about 5 feet 2 inches tall, with long dark brown hair that she often pulled back into a ponytail, especially when she went running. She had brown eyes that sparkled with intelligence and mischief, a warm smile that could light up a room, and a personality that drew people to her like moths to a flame. She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, who sent thoughtful text messages just to check in, who made everyone around her feel special and valued. Those who knew Molly described her as genuinely kind, the type of person who would go out of her way to help a stranger, who volunteered her time without being asked, and who always saw the best in people. She had recently completed her sophomore year at the University of Iowa, where she was studying psychology with dreams of becoming a child psychologist. She wanted to help children who had experienced trauma, to be a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves, to make a real difference in the world. Her professors praised her dedication, her natural empathy, and her ability to connect with people on a deep level. But Molly wasn't all serious academic pursuits. She had a playful side, a love of adventure, and a quick wit that kept her friends laughing. She loved country music, especially anything she could sing along to in the car with the windows down. She adored dogs and had a special way with animals that seemed almost magical. She was loyal to her friends, devoted to her family, and deeply in love with her boyfriend, Dalton, whom she'd been dating for several years. They had talked about marriage, about building a life together, about the family they would someday have. Molly's family was the center of her world. Her mother, Laura Calderwood, described her as just the best. A daughter who called regularly, who shared everything, who made even the mundane moments special with her enthusiasm and joy. Her father, Rob Tibbetts, spoke of her intelligence, her determination, and her fierce independence. Her younger brothers looked up to her as both a sister and a role model. She was the glue that held them together, the one who organized family gatherings, who remembered to send photos, who made sure everyone felt included and loved. In Brooklyn, Molly was known and admired. She had worked at a local daycare center and children adored her. Parents trusted her completely. She babysat for multiple families in the area, and demand for her services was always high, because kids genuinely loved spending time with her. She had a gift for making children feel heard, for turning ordinary moments into adventures, for knowing exactly how to comfort a crying toddler or engage a shy kindergartner. Her life seemed perfect. She was excelling in school. She was in a loving relationship. She had close friendships that had lasted since childhood, and she had a clear vision for her future. She was healthy, happy, and surrounded by people who loved her. There was no reason to believe that anything could go wrong, especially not in Brooklyn, Iowa, where violent crime simply didn't happen. That evening, as the sun began to set around 7:30 p.m., Molly sent a Snapchat message to her boyfriend Dalton. It was a playful photo, the kind of casual communication that had become second nature to their generation. She was in good spirits, relaxed, looking forward to her evening run. Running was part of Molly's daily routine, something she did religiously to stay in shape and to clear her mind. She typically ran the same routes through town, familiar paths she'd traveled hundreds of times before. She put on her running clothes, black running shorts, a pink sports bra, and her favorite running shoes. She secured her long brown hair in a ponytail, grabbed her phone and earbuds, and headed out the door. The dogs were fed and settled. The house was secure. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. Everything was exactly as it should be. Molly began her run heading east on 385th Avenue, a quiet rural road on the outskirts of Brooklyn. The evening was beautiful, with temperatures in the mid-70s and a gentle breeze that made for perfect running conditions. The cornfields on either side of the road were tall, their stalks swaying slightly in the wind, creating a rustling sound that was as familiar to Iowans as ocean waves are to coastal residents. The sky was beginning to turn shades of pink and orange as the sun descended toward the horizon. She had her earbuds in, listening to music as she ran, her ponytail bouncing with each stride. A few cars passed her on the rural road, their drivers likely thinking nothing of seeing the familiar sight of Molly Tibbetts on her evening jog. Some may have waved. Others may not have noticed her at all. It was such a common occurrence, such an unremarkable sight, that it barely registered in anyone's consciousness. As Molly ran past the endless rows of corn, past the occasional farmhouse with its porch light just beginning to glow in the fading daylight, past the familiar landmarks she'd seen countless times before, she had no way of knowing that she was being watched. She had no way of knowing that someone had noticed her, had focused on her, had made a decision that would change everything. She continued her run, heading farther from town, deeper into the rural landscape that surrounded Brooklyn. The road was quiet now, with long stretches between houses. The corn was tall enough that visibility was limited to the road itself and the sky above. The peaceful isolation that made evening runs so meditative and relaxing also meant there were fewer eyes to see, fewer witnesses to observe, fewer people to notice if something went wrong. Somewhere along that rural road, as the sun continued its descent and the shadows grew longer, something happened. Exactly what occurred in those moments remains partially shrouded in conflicting accounts and legal disputes. But what is certain is that Molly Tibbetts never made it home from her run that evening. The dog she was watching waited for her return. The house remained empty and quiet. The door she had locked behind her when she left stayed locked, with no one inside to open it. As the evening turned to night and the darkness settled over Brooklyn, Iowa, Molly's phone stopped transmitting data. Her Fitbit, which had been tracking her run, stopped recording her movements. Her presence in the digital world, the constant stream of communication and connection that defined modern life, suddenly went silent, but nobody knew yet. Her boyfriend was out of town and didn't expect to hear from her constantly. Her family assumed she was busy with her own evening activities. Her friends had their own plans, their own routines. In that terrible gap between when something goes wrong and when someone realizes it, Molly was already missing, already gone, already in danger, but the world continued spinning, unaware that something horrible had happened to one of its brightest lights. The next morning, when Dalton tried to reach Molly and got no response, he wasn't immediately concerned. Maybe she had slept late. Maybe her phone battery had died. Maybe she was in the shower or had gotten busy with something. But as the morning wore on and his messages went unanswered, a small seed of worry began to grow. He called his brother, asking him to check on the house. When his brother arrived, he found the dogs alone, clearly distressed at being left unattended for so long. Molly's car was parked outside where she'd left it. Her belongings were inside the house, but there was no sign of Molly herself. Her running gear was gone, suggesting she had gone for her jog as planned, but she had never returned. By the afternoon of July 19th, when Molly failed to show up for her job at a local daycare center, real alarm began to set in. This was completely unlike her. Molly was responsible, reliable, and considerate. She would never simply not show up for work without calling. She would never leave the dogs unattended for this long. She would never ignore her phone for this many hours. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. Molly's family was contacted, and their concern immediately escalated to panic. Her mother, Laura, knew instantly that something had happened. A mother's intuition, perhaps, or simply the knowledge that comes from 20 years of knowing your child's patterns and habits. Molly wouldn't just disappear. She wouldn't worry people like this. If she could contact them, she would have. The Poweshiek County Sheriff's Office received the missing person report late in the afternoon on July 19th. Initially, there was the standard protocol. The questions about whether Molly might have run away, whether she'd been upset about anything, whether there had been any arguments or problems in her relationships. But everyone who knew Molly immediately dismissed these possibilities. This wasn't a troubled teenager running away from problems. This was a responsible, happy young woman with no reason to vanish voluntarily. Law enforcement began their initial investigation by retracing what they knew of Molly's last known movements. She had been seen by several people during her evening jog on July 18th. Witnesses reported seeing her running east on Predifa Avenue around 7 and 5 p.m. She had appeared normal, running at her usual pace, wearing her typical running attire, nothing out of the ordinary. But after that point, the trail went cold. Investigators immediately secured the house where Molly had been staying. They examined every room, looking for any signs of struggle, any indication that something had happened inside the home. But everything appeared normal. There was no evidence of forced entry, no signs of a fight, no indication that anyone else had been in the house. Molly's laptop was there, her personal items were undisturbed, and there was no note, no message. Nothing to explain where she had gone or what had happened to her. The focus quickly shifted to her running route. Deputies began driving the rural roads where Molly typically ran, looking for any sign of her phone, her clothing, any indication of what might have occurred. They found nothing. The cornfields that bordered the roads were searched, but the sheer vastness of the agricultural landscape made a comprehensive search nearly impossible. Miles and miles of corn, most of it taller than a person, created countless places where evidence could be hidden, where something terrible could have occurred unseen. As word spread through Brooklyn that Molly Tibbetts was missing, the small-town community responded with immediate and overwhelming concern. This was one of their own, a girl they had watched grow up, a young woman they knew and loved. The idea that something could have happened to her in their safe, peaceful town was almost incomprehensible. But as the hours turned into days with no sign of Molly, the reality began to sink in. Their safe little town had been touched by something dark. Volunteers began organizing search parties. Hundreds of people turned out to help, many of them Molly's friends and classmates. Others simply community members who wanted to do something, anything to help find her. They walked through fields, searched along roads and creeks, checked abandoned buildings and wooded areas. The University of Iowa sent counselors to help support Molly's friends and classmates who were struggling with the uncertainty and fear. Missing person flyers with Molly's photo began appearing everywhere, on telephone poles and store windows, on social media feeds across the nation. Molly's family established a Facebook page called Finding Molly Tibbetts, which quickly gained tens of thousands of followers. Her mother made emotional public pleas for information, begging anyone who knew anything to come forward. "Molly, we love you," she said in one tearful video. "We will never give up looking for you. Please, if anyone knows anything at all, please contact the authorities." The FBI became involved in the investigation on July 20th, just 2 days after Molly was last seen. Their involvement signaled the seriousness of the situation and brought additional resources to the search. Special agents trained in missing persons cases, forensic experts, and behavioral analysts joined local law enforcement in what was rapidly becoming a massive investigation. One of the first major investigative steps was analyzing Molly's digital footprint. In the modern age, people leave behind a trail of electronic breadcrumbs, cell phone data, social media activity, GPS information, credit card transactions. Investigators pulled Molly's phone records, hoping to track her movements through cell tower pings. They examined her social media accounts for any unusual messages or concerning interactions. They checked her bank accounts and cards for any activity after she disappeared. But there was nothing. After she sent that final snapshot to Dalton around 30 p.m. on July 18th, her digital presence simply ceased to exist. Her Fitbit data was particularly valuable because it tracked her exact movements during her run. The data showed she had run approximately 4 miles, heading east from the house, before the device stopped transmitting. The exact location where the Fitbit stopped recording became a critical area of focus for investigators. What had happened at that spot? Had she stopped running? Had something occurred that prevented the device from continuing to transmit? Or had something happened to Molly herself? The Snapchat message to Dalton was examined frame by frame. In the photo, Molly appeared happy and relaxed, giving no indication that she felt threatened or afraid. The metadata from the image confirmed it was taken inside the house where she'd been staying, just before she left for her run. Nothing in the image suggested anything was wrong. Investigators began the painstaking process of interviewing everyone who might have information. Dalton Jack was interviewed extensively, as romantic partners are always persons of interest in missing persons cases. But he had a solid alibi. He had been at work about 100 miles away in Dubuque at the time Molly disappeared, a fact confirmed by multiple co-workers and electronic time records. His phone records showed no suspicious activity. His demeanor during interviews appeared genuinely distraught. Investigators eventually cleared him as a suspect. Molly's ex-boyfriends were interviewed. Her friends, both male and female, were questioned. Her co-workers at the daycare center were asked if they had noticed anything unusual or if Molly had mentioned any problems. Her classmates at the University of Iowa were contacted. Family members were interviewed. The list of people questioned grew into the hundreds as investigators cast a wide net, looking for any possible lead. The home where Molly had been staying was processed as a potential crime scene, despite the lack of obvious evidence. Forensic teams collected fingerprints, searched for trace evidence, and examined every surface for any clue. The dogs Molly had been watching were cared for by family members, but even they were observed for any behavioral signs that might indicate they had witnessed something traumatic. Security camera footage from businesses and homes in Brooklyn was collected and reviewed. Investigators watched hours and hours of grainy footage, looking for any sign of Molly or any suspicious vehicles or people in the area around the time she disappeared. Several cars were identified as having been in the area during the relevant time period, but tracking down their owners and determining whether they had any connection to Molly's disappearance proved challenging. As the days passed with no sign of Molly, the investigation expanded to include the possibility that she had been abducted by someone passing through the area. Interstate 80 runs relatively close to Brooklyn, making it possible for someone to commit a crime and quickly leave the region. The FBI began checking similar cases in surrounding states, looking for patterns or suspects who might have been in Iowa in mid-July. Tips began pouring in from across the country. The FBI set up a dedicated tip line, and agents worked around the clock to follow up on every lead, no matter how unlikely. Reported sightings came from dozens of states. Someone claimed to have seen Molly at a truck stop in Missouri. Another caller said they saw her at a grocery store in Minnesota. Each lead had to be investigated. Each sighting had to be checked and verified or debunked. The vast majority led nowhere. Dead ends that consumed valuable time and resources, but brought investigators no closer to finding Molly. Psychics contacted the family offering their services. Volunteers continued to organize searches, combing through fields and wooded areas for miles around Brooklyn. The media coverage intensified, with national news outlets picking up the story. Molly's photograph appeared on television screens across America. Her case was featured on crime shows and news programs. The hashtag Finding Molly trended on social media platforms. But despite all the attention, all the resources, all the desperate searching, Molly remained missing. Each day that passed made the situation more dire. Statistically, the chances of finding missing alive decreased dramatically after the first 48 hours. By the end of July, nearly 2 weeks after Molly vanished, hope was beginning to fade. Though her family refused to give up, investigators kept returning to the same questions. What had happened during Molly's run? Had she been grabbed off the road? Had someone lured her somehow? Had she been followed? And most importantly, who would want to harm Molly Tibbetts, a young woman with no enemies, no dangerous associations, no reason to be targeted? The FBI began an intensive canvassing operation in Brooklyn, going door to door, business to business, interviewing anyone and everyone who might have seen something on the evening of July 18th. They asked residents to check their properties, their outbuildings, their land for anything unusual. They requested that farmers search their fields and equipment. They asked businesses to turn over any security footage they might have, even if it seemed unrelated. One particular focus of the investigation became the various workers who had been in the Brooklyn area during the relevant time period. Construction crews, farm workers, delivery drivers, anyone who might have been passing through or working in the vicinity. Investigators knew that Molly had been running on a rural road, which meant traffic would have been light, and any vehicle in the area might be significant. Agricultural workers were of particular interest because it was harvest season, and temporary workers were common in the area. Many of these workers moved from farm to farm, often living in temporary housing, and might have left the area after Molly's disappearance. Tracking down and interviewing these individuals proved to be a massive undertaking, complicated by language barriers, transient living situations, and the sheer number of people involved in agricultural work in rural Iowa. Meanwhile, Molly's family struggled to maintain hope while preparing for the worst. They gave interviews pleading for her safe return, but as the weeks wore on, the questions from reporters began to shift from, "Do you think she'll be found?" to, "How are you coping with the possibility that she might not come home?" The shift was subtle but devastating, a reflection of the grim reality that time was running out. Laura Calderwood, Molly's mother, refused to give up. She appeared on national television, holding up photos of her daughter, describing Molly's personality, her dreams, her kindness. "Someone knows something," she insisted. "Someone saw something. Please come forward. Help us bring Molly home." Rob Tibbetts, Molly's father, took a leave from his job and traveled to Iowa to be closer to the search efforts. He worked with volunteers, coordinated with investigators, and became a visible presence in the community, a reminder that Molly was more than a missing person statistic. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a real person with a real family desperately trying to find her. The community of Brooklyn rallied around the Tibbetts family in extraordinary ways. Fundraisers were organized to support the search efforts. Local businesses donated food and supplies for volunteers. Churches held prayer vigils. The high school football team wore blue ribbons in Molly's honor. The entire town seemed to be united in a single purpose: finding Molly and bringing her home safely. But as July turned to August, the investigation seemed to be stalling. Despite thousands of tips, hundreds of interviews, and countless hours of police work, there were no solid leads. The case was becoming colder with each passing day, and investigators knew that without a break, without some new piece of evidence or information, they might never know what happened to Molly Tibbetts. Then, in early August, investigators decided to try a different approach. They began a systematic review of all video footage from businesses and homes in the area, not just from the evening Molly disappeared, but from the days and weeks leading up to it. They were looking for patterns, for vehicles or people who appeared repeatedly, for anything that seemed out of place or unusual. One particular piece of footage caught their attention. A homeowner in the rural area where Molly had been running had a security camera that captured a portion of the road. The footage from July 18th showed several vehicles passing by during the time period when Molly would have been on her run. One vehicle in particular appeared multiple times. A black Chevy Malibu that seemed to be driving slowly, almost as if the driver was looking for something or someone. This was the break investigators had been hoping for. If they could identify the owner of that black Chevy Malibu, They might finally have a suspect. The vehicle became the top priority of the investigation, and agents began the process of trying to track it down. The black Chevy Malibu captured on security footage became the central focus of the FBI's investigation. Agents meticulously reviewed every frame of video, trying to identify any distinguishing features of the vehicle. They enhanced the images, analyzed the angle of the sun to determine the exact time the car passed by, and studied the driver's movements. The footage showed the vehicle passing the same stretch of road multiple times during the period when Molly would been running, behavior that was highly unusual for a rural road where most traffic consisted of residents heading directly to their destinations. Investigators began the painstaking process of identifying every black Chevy Malibu in the region. They contacted dealerships, checked DMV records, and compiled a list of potential vehicles that matched the description. The list was extensive. The Chevy Malibu was a popular model, and black was a common color. But each vehicle on the list represented a potential lead, a possible connection to Molly's disappearance. Teams of agents fanned out across Poweshiek County and surrounding areas, locating and documenting every black Chevy Malibu they could find. They photographed the vehicles, interviewed the owners, and checked their whereabouts on July 18th. Most were quickly eliminated from consideration. Owners had solid alibis, or their vehicles didn't quite match the one in the footage, or they had legitimate reasons for being in the area that had nothing to do with Molly. But the investigation continued methodically, systematically working through the list. Investigators knew that somewhere among all these vehicles was likely the one they were looking for, and finding it might finally provide answers about what had happened to Molly Tibbetts. While the search for the black Chevy Malibu continued, other aspects of the investigation remained active. Volunteer search parties still went out regularly, though the initial massive turnout had dwindled to a dedicated core of individuals who refused to give up. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation continued processing tips that came in through the hotline. The FBI's behavioral analysts were developing profiles of potential suspects, trying to understand what kind of person would target a young woman jogging in broad daylight on a rural road. The media attention remained intense. Molly's case had captured national interest, partly because she was a photogenic young woman with a bright future, partly because the mystery of her disappearance was so complete. There were no witnesses to an abduction, no evidence of foul play at any location, no ransom demands, no communication of any kind. She had simply vanished, one as ordinary as going for a run. Crime shows featured Molly's case, with experts speculating about what might have happened. Some theorized she had been the victim of a random predator, someone driving through the area who had seen an opportunity and acted on impulse. Others suggested the crime might have been planned, that someone had been watching Molly, learning her routines, waiting for the right moment. Still others wondered if her disappearance might be connected to other missing persons cases in the region. Molly's family continued their media appearances, never missing an opportunity to keep her face in the public eye. Laura Calderwood appeared on morning talk shows, afternoon news programs, and evening crime shows. She described Molly in loving detail, painting a picture of her daughter that made viewers feel they knew her personally. She talked about Molly's quirks, how she loved to sing off-key in the car, how she had a special relationship with every dog she met, how she could make anyone laugh even on their worst days. Rob Tibbetts spoke about his daughter's intelligence and ambition. He shared stories about her childhood, about the little girl who had grown into a remarkable young woman. He described her compassion, her work with children, her dream of becoming a child psychologist. He talked about the hole her absence had left in their family, the empty chair at the dinner table, the phone that no longer rang with her calls. Molly's brothers struggled to comprehend what had happened to their sister. They participated in searches, distributed flyers, and maintained social media campaigns to keep attention focused on the case. They shared memories and photos, creating a digital memorial to a sister who they desperately hoped would still come home. Dalton Jack, Molly's boyfriend, was devastated. Despite having been cleared by investigators, he faced scrutiny and suspicion from some members of the public who believed that romantic partners were always the most likely suspects. He gave interviews defending himself while also expressing his love for Molly and his hope that she would be found safe. The strain was visible on his face, the weight of grief and helplessness aging him beyond his years. The community of Brooklyn was transformed by Molly's disappearance. The sense of safety and security that had defined the small town was shattered. Parents no longer allowed their children to walk to friends' houses alone. Women stopped jogging on rural roads by themselves. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now bolted and chained. The trust that had characterized the community was replaced by suspicion and fear. Local businesses displayed, "Bring Molly home" signs in their windows. Blue ribbons symbolizing hope for Molly's safe return appeared on trees, mailboxes, and car antennas throughout the town. The high school dedicated their football season to Molly, with players wearing her initials on their helmets. The University of Iowa held candlelight vigils, with hundreds of students gathering to pray for Molly's safe return and to support her grieving family. But as August progressed, the reality of the situation became increasingly bleak. Statistically, the chances of finding Molly alive were diminishing with each passing day. Law enforcement officials, while maintaining public optimism, privately began to prepare for the likelihood that when Molly was found, it would not be alive. The investigation in the black Chevy Malibu continued to progress slowly. By mid-August, investigators had tracked down and examined dozens of vehicles, but none had provided the breakthrough they needed. Then, during a routine canvassing operation in the area, an FBI agent noticed a black Chevy Malibu at a dairy farm on the outskirts of Brooklyn. The farm was a large operation that employed several workers, many of them immigrants who worked long hours in difficult conditions. The black Chevy Malibu belonged to one of these workers, a man named Christian Bahena Rivera. He was 24 years old, had been living in the area for several years, and worked at Yarrabee Farms, a large dairy operation that was a significant employer in the region. Agents approached Bahena Rivera on August 20, 2018, more than a month after Molly had disappeared. They asked if they could speak with him about his vehicle and whether he had been in the area on July 18th. Initially, the conversation was casual, non-confrontational. Agents didn't want to spook a potential suspect before they had more information. Bahena Rivera agreed to talk with the agents. He was cooperative, answering questions about his work schedule, his vehicle, and his activities. When asked if he had been driving in the area where Molly disappeared, he initially said he didn't remember. He claimed he drove in that area frequently as part of his daily routine, so one particular day wouldn't stand out in his memory. But investigators had more than just casual questions. They had been analyzing video footage, comparing the Chevy Malibu and the security camera recordings with Bahena Rivera's vehicle. The details matched the same model year, the same distinctive features, even what appeared to be the same minor damage on one of the body panels. They were confident they had found the right car. The interview shifted from casual conversation to something more serious. Agents asked Bahena Rivera if he would be willing to come to the sheriff's office to answer more detailed questions. He agreed, perhaps not fully understanding the situation he was in, perhaps believing that cooperation would clear him of any suspicion. At the sheriff's office, Bahena Rivera was interviewed by FBI agents and local law enforcement. The questioning was methodical and strategic, designed to gather information while watching for signs of deception. Agents asked about his daily routine, his work schedule on July 18th, his typical routes when driving around the area. They asked if he remembered seeing a young woman jogging on the rural roads. They showed him Molly's photograph. For hours, Bahena Rivera maintained that he didn't know anything about Molly's disappearance. He claimed he might have seen joggers in the area before, but he couldn't recall anyone specific. He said he had no involvement in whatever had happened to the missing girl. His demeanor was calm, controlled, showing little emotion as the questioning continued. But investigators had developed extensive experience in interviewing suspects, and they recognized certain patterns in Bahena Rivera's responses. There were inconsistencies in his timeline, moments of hesitation when answering seemingly straightforward questions, and subtle changes in his body language when certain topics were raised. As the interview progressed, agents began to apply more pressure. They told Bahina Rivera that they had evidence placing his vehicle in the area at the exact time Molly was jogging. They explained that they had video footage showing his car passing by multiple times, behavior that suggested he had been looking for something or someone. They pressed him to explain why he had been in that area, what he had been doing, what he had seen. The interrogation lasted for hours, stretching late into the night of August 20th and into the early morning hours of August 21st. Agents rotated in and out of the interview room, maintaining constant pressure while Bahina Rivera grew increasingly tired and stressed. This was a critical moment in the investigation, and everyone involved knew that what happened in that interview room might determine whether Molly Tibbetts would ever be found. According to the official police account of the interrogation, Bahina Rivera's story began to change as the hours wore on. He admitted that he had seen Molly jogging on July 18th. He said he had noticed her and had found her attractive. He claimed that he had driven past her, then turned around and drove past her again, watching her as she ran along the rural road. Agents pressed for more details. What happened next? Did he stop? Did he speak to her? Bahina Rivera's responses became more fragmented, his story shifting and evolving as the interrogation continued. According to investigators, he claimed that he had parked his car and gotten out, that he had approached Molly while she was running. The exact details of what Bahina Rivera said during this interrogation would later become a matter of intense legal dispute, with his defense attorneys arguing that the confession was coerced and should not be admissible in court. But according to the prosecution's account, Bahina Rivera eventually admitted to following Molly in his vehicle, becoming angry when she threatened to call the police on him, and ultimately causing her death. The most critical question remained: where was Molly? If Bahina Rivera was responsible for her disappearance, what had he done with her body? Investigators needed to find Molly, to bring her home to her family, to recover evidence that would support any charges against this suspect. According to the official police account, during the interrogation, Bahina Rivera was presented with aerial photographs of the rural areas surrounding Brooklyn. Investigators asked him to show them where Molly could be found. After initially refusing, he allegedly pointed to a location in a cornfield about 12 miles southeast of Brooklyn. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 20, 2018, law enforcement vehicles quietly made their way to the location Bahina Rivera had indicated. The area was remote, surrounded by vast agricultural fields, accessible only by dirt roads that wound through miles of farmland. This was the kind of place where someone could dispose of a body with little risk of discovery, where the tall corn provided cover from prying eyes, where the isolation meant that a crime could go unwitnessed. Officers and FBI agents spread out across the cornfield, using flashlights to navigate through the tall stalks that towered over their heads. The corn was thick and green, the summer growth creating a dense barrier that made visibility difficult and movement challenging. They moved slowly, carefully, knowing that they were potentially entering a crime scene, aware that they needed to preserve evidence while also trying to locate Molly. It was one of the investigators who found her first. Deep in the cornfield, hidden beneath corn stalks that had been placed over her body, lay the remains of Molly Tibbetts. She was still wearing her running clothes, the black shorts and pink sports bra she had put on more than a month earlier when she left for what should have been a routine evening jog. Her body showed signs of decomposition from having been exposed to the August heat for over a month, but she was recognizable. The investigators had found Molly. The scene was immediately secured as a crime scene. Additional law enforcement personnel were called in. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigations crime scene team was summoned to process the area. Medical examiners were notified and began making their way to the remote location. The FBI's evidence response team prepared to conduct a thorough examination of the site. As dawn broke over the Iowa cornfields on August 21st, news began to spread that there had been a major development in the Molly Tibbetts case. Law enforcement scheduled a press conference for later that day. Reporters from across the country began converging on Brooklyn, knowing that the month-long mystery was about to be resolved, though not in the way anyone had hoped. The Tibbets family was notified before the public announcement was made. The call they had been dreading for over a month had finally come. Molly had been found, but she had not been found alive. The young woman who had gone out for a routine jog on a summer evening, who had her whole life ahead her, who had been loved by so many people, was dead. Laura Calderwood's worst nightmare had come true. The daughter she had been desperately searching for, the girl she had pleaded for on television, the child she had hoped against hope would come home safely, was gone. Rob Tibbets faced the unbearable reality that he would never again hear his daughter's voice, never see her graduate from college, never walk her down the aisle, never meet the grandchildren she might have given him. At the press conference held on the afternoon of August 21st, law enforcement officials confirmed that Molly Tibbets' body had been found and that a suspect was in custody. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community and across the nation. The case that had captivated America for over a month had reached its tragic conclusion. Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation Special Agent in Charge Rick Ron stood before a room full of reporters and cameras. His face was somber, his voice heavy with the weight of the announcement he had to make. "I'm sad to report that earlier this morning, investigators found what's believed to be the remains of Molly Tibbets," he said. The room erupted with questions, but Ron continued with the prepared statement. He confirmed that a suspect, later identified as Christian Bahena Rivera, had been arrested and charged with first-degree murder in connection with Molly's death. He provided few details about how the investigation had led to Bahena Rivera, or what evidence connected him to the crime. Citing the ongoing nature of the investigation and the need to preserve the integrity of the prosecution, the news spread rapidly. Within minutes, every major news outlet in the country was reporting that Molly Tibbets had been found dead and that a suspect was in custody. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from grief to anger to political commentary. The case that had been a missing person investigation was now a murder case, and the nature of the conversation changed dramatically. In Brooklyn, the community that had held on to hope for over a month was devastated. The blue ribbons that had symbolized hope for Molly's safe return now represented mourning for a life cut short. The vigils that had been held to pray for her safe return became memorials to honor her memory. The town that had come together to search for one of their own now came together to grieve. The University of Iowa held a memorial service for Molly where hundreds of students, faculty, and staff gathered to remember the bright, kind young woman who had been taken from them. Her professors spoke about her academic promise, her genuine interest in helping others, and the loss of what she could have become. Her classmates shared memories of her kindness, her humor, and her friendship. The chapel overflowed with mourners, a testament to the impact Molly had made in her 20 years of life. At Yarrabee Farms, where Bahena Rivera had worked, there was shock and disbelief among his co-workers. Many who knew him described him as quiet, hardworking, and unremarkable. He had been employed at the farm for several years, living in a trailer on the property, and had never given any indication that he was capable of violence. The revelation that someone they worked alongside could have committed such a crime left them shaken and questioning their own judgment. The autopsy of Molly's remains was conducted by the Iowa State Medical Examiner's Office. Due to the decomposition of her body after being exposed to summer heat for over a month, determining exact cause of death was challenging. However, the medical examiner was able to determine that Molly had suffered multiple sharp force injuries. The official cause of death was listed as multiple sharp force injuries, and the manner of death was ruled a homicide. The sharp force injuries indicated that Molly had been stabbed, a violent and personal method of killing that suggested rage, panic, or both. The nature of the wounds painted a terrible picture of Molly's final moments, of a young woman fighting for her life, of violence inflicted on someone who had done nothing to deserve such a fate. Investigators processed the crime scene in the cornfield with meticulous care. They photographed every aspect of the scene, documented the position of Molly's body, collected soil samples, and searched the surrounding area for any additional evidence. The corn stalks that had been placed over her body were examined for trace evidence. The ground beneath her was carefully evaded and sifted for any items that might have been left behind. Bahina Rivera's vehicle was impounded and processed as evidence. Forensic technicians went over every inch of the black Chevy Malibu, looking for traces of Molly's presence, for blood evidence, for anything that might corroborate or contradict Bahina Rivera's statements during his interrogation. They collected fiber samples, fingerprints, DA samples, and any other trace evidence that might prove relevant to the case. The investigation had evolved from a missing person case to a homicide investigation, and the focus now shifted to building a case that would ensure justice for Molly. The Poweshiek County Attorney's Office, working in conjunction with the Iowa Attorney General's Office, began preparing the prosecution. The charges against Bahina Rivera were serious. First-degree murder in Iowa carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even as the investigation moved forward, new questions emerged. Who exactly was Christian Bahina Rivera? What was his background? Had there been any warning signs that he might be capable of such violence? Were there other victims? How had he managed to avoid detection for over a month, while an intensive investigation was ongoing? Investigators began digging into Bahina Rivera's history. He was 24 years old, originally from Mexico, and had been living in the United States for several years. He had come to Iowa to work in the agricultural sector, where labor was in constant demand and jobs were available for dulling to difficult physical work for modest pay. He had been employed at Yarrabee Farms for about 4 years, living in worker housing on the property and maintaining a low profile. His employer, Yarrabee Farms, released a statement expressing shock and sadness about Molly's death, and confirming that Bahina Rivera had been an employee in good standing. The farm emphasized that he had passed a background check when he was hired and had shown no signs of being a threat to anyone. The statement did little to quell the questions about how such a person could have been living and working in the community while harboring such violence. Background checks revealed that Bahina Rivera had no significant criminal history. There were no prior arrests for violence, no restraining orders, no red flags that would have suggested he posed a danger. To everyone who knew him, he appeared to be simply a quiet farm worker trying to make a living. The disconnect between his public persona and the crime he was accused of committing was jarring. Investigators interviewed Bahina Rivera's co-workers, friends, and acquaintances, trying to build a complete picture of his life and behavior. Most described him as reserved and hardworking, someone who kept to himself and didn't cause problems. Some mentioned that he had a girlfriend and a child, which made the crime seem even more incomprehensible. How could someone with their own family commit such violence against someone else's daughter? The investigation also revealed details about Bahina Rivera's immigration status, which would later become a source of significant political controversy. According to authorities, he was in the United States illegally, having entered the country without proper documentation. This fact immediately politicized the case, with various groups using Molly's murder to argue for or against different immigration policies. Molly's father, Rob Tibbetts, would later express frustration with the politicization of his daughter's death, asking that her memory not be used as a political weapon. But the damage was done. The case had become part of the national conversation about immigration, border security, and crime, whether the family wanted that or not. As the investigation continued, detectives tried to establish a timeline of events on July 18th. According to the evidence in Bahina Rivera's alleged confession, he had been driving in the area when he saw Molly jogging. He had become fixated on her, following her in his vehicle, watching her as she ran along the rural road. The security footage that had been the breakthrough in the case showed his vehicle passing by multiple times, a visual record of his stalking behavior. At some point, according to investigators, Bahina Rivera had stopped his vehicle and approached Molly on foot. Exactly what happened next would be disputed and debated, but the outcome was clear. Molly Tibbetts had been killed and her body had been hidden in a cornfield, where it might never have been found if not for Bahina Rivera's alleged confession. The details of what transpired between Christian Bahina Rivera and Molly Tibbetts during those terrible moments on July 18th would become the subject of intense scrutiny legal debate, and conflicting narratives. According to the prosecution's interpretation of Bahina Rivera's statements during his interrogation, he had been driving in the area when he saw Molly jogging and became attracted to her. He claimed he had driven past her multiple times, circling back to see her again. His behavior escalating from mere observation to active pursuit, the prosecution alleged that Bahina Rivera eventually parked his vehicle and approached Molly while she was running. According to his reported statements, Molly became frightened when she realized the stranger was following her. She pulled out her phone and threatened to call the police unless he left her alone. This threat, according to the prosecution's theory, had triggered something in Bahina Rivera: anger, panic, or fear of the consequences he might face if police became involved. What happened next was the subject of conflicting accounts that would later be presented in court. According to the prosecution's version based on Bahina Rivera's alleged confession, he had become angry at Molly's rejection and threat to call authorities. In his rage or panic, he attacked her. The nature of the attack: multiple sharp force injuries that would ultimately be determined as the cause of death, suggested a frenzied, violent assault. The medical examiner's findings indicated that Molly had suffered at least 7 stab wounds, some of them defensive wounds on her hands, suggesting she had tried to fight off her attacker. The forensic evidence painted a horrifying picture of Molly's final moments. A young woman who had been enjoying an evening run suddenly faced with a threat, who had tried to de-escalate the situation by threatening to call police, who had then fought desperately for her life as she was stabbed repeatedly. After killing Molly, according to the prosecution, Bahina Rivera had placed her body in the trunk of his black Chevy Malibu. He then drove approximately 12 miles to a remote cornfield, carried her body into the field, and covered it with corn stalks in an attempt to conceal what he had done. Then he had simply returned to his life, going to work the next day as if nothing had happened, while an entire community searched desperately for the young woman he had killed. For over a month, as hundreds of volunteers searched fields and roads, as Molly's family made tearful pleas on television, as FBI agents worked around the clock to find her, Bahina Rivera had maintained his silence. He had continued his daily routine, working at the dairy farm, living in his trailer, interacting with co-workers and community members, all while knowing exactly where Molly's body could be found. The psychological profile of someone capable of such compartmentalization, committing a violent murder, and then carrying on with normal life while a massive search unfolds, suggested either profound callousness or an ability to psychologically separate himself from his actions. Forensic psychologists who later examined the case noted that this behavior was not uncommon among certain types of offenders, particularly those who commit crimes of opportunity rather than premeditated murders. The investigation into Bahina Rivera's background continued in the days and weeks following his arrest. Detectives wanted to know if there were other victims, if this was truly a spontaneous act, or if there was a pattern of predatory behavior that had gone undetected. They examined unsolved cases in the region, looking for any similarities or connections. They interviewed women in the area, asking if Bahina Rivera had ever made them uncomfortable or exhibited concerning behavior. What emerged was a more complex picture than the simple narrative of a random predator. Several women who worked in the agricultural community came forward to say that Bahina Rivera had occasionally made comments they found uncomfortable, though nothing that had seemed overtly threatening at the time. Some described him as someone who would stare at women for uncomfortably long periods. Others mentioned that he had sometimes tried to engage in conversation with women who clearly weren't interested. These reports, while concerning in retrospect, had not been significant enough at the time to raise serious alarms. They painted a picture of someone whose behavior around women was sometimes inappropriate but hadn't crossed lines that would have resulted in complaints to management or law enforcement. It was only with the hindsight provided by Molly's murder that these behaviors took on a more sinister significance. Investigators also examined Bahina Rivera's movements in the months leading up to Molly's disappearance. Cell phone records showed that he had driven in the area where Molly typically ran on multiple occasions, though whether this was coincidental as the area was near his workplace, or evidence of prior stalking behavior remained unclear. His internet search history was subpoenaed and examined for any indication that he had been researching Molly or planning an attack, but nothing definitive was found. The question of how Bahena Rivera had obtained the weapon used to kill Molly became another focus of the investigation. Despite extensive searches of his residence, vehicle, and workplace, no knife matching the description of the murder weapon was ever recovered. This became a challenge for prosecutors, who would have to prove their case without the actual weapon that had been used to kill Molly. The lack of the murder weapon also raised questions about Bahena Rivera's level of premeditation. Had he disposed of the weapon immediately after the crime, suggesting awareness of his actions and their consequences? Or had the weapon been something he happened to have with him, making the crime more spontaneous? As the criminal case against Bahena Rivera was being built, Molly's family faced the agonizing task of planning her funeral. The young woman who had disappeared on July 18th, while full of life and promise, would now be laid to rest. The funeral arrangements became a public event, with hundreds of people wanting to pay their respects to Molly and support her grieving family. The funeral service for Molly Tibbetts was held on August 26, 2018, at the Grinnell High School Gymnasium, chosen because no church in the area was large enough to accommodate the expected crowd. More than 1,500 people attended, filling the gymnasium to capacity while others stood outside, unable to get in but wanting to be present nonetheless. The service was a celebration of Molly's life, but also a raw expression of grief for all that had been lost. Rob Tibbetts delivered a eulogy for his daughter that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. He spoke about Molly's joy, her kindness, her dreams that would never be fulfilled. He talked about the family's grief but also about their determination not to let Molly's life be defined solely by her death. Molly was nobody's victim, he declared. Molly was my hero. He urged those gathered to honor Molly's memory by living with the same kindness and compassion she had shown to others. Laura Calderwood spoke through tears about the daughter she had lost, sharing intimate memories of Molly's childhood, her teenage years, and the young woman she had become. She described Molly's laugh, her terrible singing voice that she deployed with enthusiasm regardless, her love for animals, and her genuine care for everyone she met. She made everyone feel special, Laura said. That was her gift, making people feel seen and valued. Dalton Jack, Molly's boyfriend, struggled through his remarks about the woman he had planned to marry. He spoke about their relationship, their dreams for the future, and the hole her absence would leave in his life. He described the guilt he felt for not being there when she needed him, even though logically he knew there was nothing he could have done. The pain in his voice as he spoke about the life they would never have together was palpable. Friends from the University of Iowa shared stories about Molly, painting a picture of a young woman who was deeply engaged with life and the people around her. They talked about her academic dedication, her work with children, her infectious enthusiasm, and her ability to find joy in simple moments. They described study sessions that turned into laughter-filled conversations, road trips with terrible music choices, and late-night talks about their dreams and fears. The service included music that Molly had loved, though her friends noted with tears and smiles that she would probably be singing along off-key if she were there. Photos of Molly throughout her life were displayed, as a toddler, as a young girl, as a teenager, and as the beautiful young woman she had become. Each image was a reminder of the life that had been stolen, of a never be, of the future that had been taken away. After the service, Molly was buried at a private ceremony attended only by close family and friends. The family requested privacy for this final goodbye, wanting to grieve without the presence of cameras and strangers. In death, as in life, Molly was surrounded by those who loved her most. In the weeks following Molly's funeral, the legal proceedings against Christian Bahena Rivera began in earnest. He was formally charged with first-degree murder, and his initial court appearances drew intense media attention. The young man who appeared in court, wearing an orange jail jumpsuit and shackles, seemed unremarkable: average height, dark hair, an expressionless face that gave no indication of his thoughts or feelings. Bahina Rivera was appointed public defenders to represent him, as he could not afford to hire private attorneys. His defense team faced an enormous challenge. Their client had allegedly confessed to the crime during police interrogation, and his confession had led directly to the discovery of Molly's body. Building a defense against such damaging evidence would require attacking the confession itself, claiming it was coerced or involuntary. The defense team immediately filed motions to suppress Bahina Rivera's confession, arguing that it had been obtained in violation of his constitutional rights. They claimed that the interrogation had lasted for hours without proper breaks, that Bahina Rivera had not fully understood his Miranda rights due to language barriers, and that investigators had used coercive tactics to extract a confession. These motions would become a central battleground in the legal proceedings. Meanwhile, the prosecution was building their case with meticulous attention to detail. They compiled the video evidence showing Bahina Rivera's vehicle in the area where Molly was running. They prepared testimony from forensic experts about the DNA evidence, the autopsy findings, and the analysis of the crime scene. They organized witness testimony from the investigators who had interrogated Bahina Rivera, and from the officers who had found Molly's body based on his directions. The immigration status of Bahina Rivera became a contentious issue that extended far beyond the courtroom. Politicians on both sides of the immigration debate seized on the case to support their positions. Some argued that Molly's death demonstrated the need for stricter border security and more aggressive deportation policies. Others countered that the vast majority of immigrants, documented or not, were not criminals, and that using one tragic case to demonize an entire population was both unfair and illogical. Rob Tibbetts spoke out forcefully against the politicization of his daughter's death. In an emotional op-ed piece and in various interviews, he expressed frustration that Molly's memory was being used to promote political agendas she would not have supported. He noted that the Hispanic community in Brooklyn had been among the most active in searching for Molly and supporting the family during their ordeal. He urged people to remember Molly as she was a kind, compassionate person who would not have wanted her death used to spread hate or division. But the political controversy continued regardless of the family's wishes. The case became a talking point in debates about immigration policy, sanctuary cities, and border security. News outlets with different political leanings covered the case in dramatically different ways, some emphasizing Bahina Rivera's immigration status as the central fact of the case, others focusing primarily on Molly's life and the investigation into her death. In Brooklyn, the community struggled to process not just the loss of Molly, but the revelation that someone living and working among them had been capable of such violence. There was anger directed at Yarrabee Farms for employing Bahina Rivera, though the farm had followed legal requirements for back checks and employment verification. There was broader anger at a system that had allowed someone without legal immigration status to live and work in the area for years. But there was also a recognition that finger pointing and blame didn't bring Molly back. The community rallied around the Tibbetts family, establishing a scholarship fund in Molly's name for students pursuing degrees in psychology or child development. The University of Iowa created a memorial garden in her honor. Her former high school dedicated a bench overlooking the football field where she had cheered, her friends had played, and her community had gathered. As autumn arrived in Iowa, the corn in the fields where Molly's body had been found was harvested, the land prepared for winter. The changing seasons seemed to underscore the passage of time, the way life continued moving forward even in the wake of tragedy. Molly's family faced the first of many painful milestones, her birthday in May, which she would never celebrate again. The holidays without her presence, the graduation she would never walk across the stage to receive. The legal proceedings against Bahina Rivera moved slowly through the court system, as murder cases typically do. Pre-trial motions were filed, argued, and ruled upon. Evidence was examined and debated. Witness lists were compiled. The prosecution and defense prepared their strategies for what would eventually be a trial. In December 2018, just a few months after Molly's death, Judge Joel Yates ruled on several key pre-trial motions. Most significantly for the prosecution, he ruled that Bahina Rivera's confession would be admissible at trial, rejecting the defense's arguments that it had been coerced. The judge found that Bahina Rivera had been properly advised of his rights and that his confession had been given voluntarily. This was a major victory for the prosecution, as the confession was the cornerstone of their case. The defense, however, continued to prepare their strategy. Even with the confession admissible, they could still argue at trial that it was unreliable, that Bahina Rivera had been confused, or had told investigators what they wanted to hear after hours of interrogation. They could present alternative theories about what had happened to Molly. They could attack the quality of the investigation or the strength of the physical evidence. As 2019 began, the case remained in pre-trial proceedings. Both sides continued gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and preparing for trial. The prosecution brought in expert witnesses to testify about various aspects of the case, forensic pathologists who could explain Molly's injuries, DNA analysts who could discuss the genetic evidence, digital forensics experts who could testify about cell phone data and GPS information. The defense sought their own expert witnesses who could challenge the prosecution's evidence or provide alternative interpretations. They hired forensic psychologists to evaluate Bahina Rivera and potentially testify about his mental state. They consulted with experts on interrogation techniques who could testify about the reliability of confessions obtained after lengthy questioning. Throughout this period, the Tibbetts family lived in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the trial that would determine whether justice would be served for Molly. Every court date, every motion, every piece of news about the case reopened wounds that were struggling to heal. Laura Calderwood threw herself into advocacy work for victims' families and missing persons cases, channeling her grief into efforts to help others. Rob Tibbetts focused on preserving Molly's memory and supporting her brothers as they tried to rebuild their lives. The community of Brooklyn gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the town had been forever changed by what had happened. Parents were more cautious about their children's activities. Women were more aware of their surroundings when exercising alone. The innocence and sense of complete security that had characterized the small town was gone, replaced by a more guarded awareness that bad things could happen anywhere, even in the safest seeming places. Then, as the case moved closer to trial, a new development emerged that would add another layer of complexity to an already complicated case. In September 2020, more than 2 years after Molly's death, Bahina Rivera's defense team filed a motion claiming they had discovered new evidence that pointed to alternative suspects. According to the defense motion, a man incarcerated on unrelated charges had come forward claiming that he and another individual had been responsible for Molly's death, not Bahina Rivera. The inmate alleged that he and an accomplice had abducted Molly, that things had gone too far, and that they had killed her. He claimed that Bahina Rivera had been used as a scapegoat because of his immigration status. This revelation sent shockwaves through the legal proceedings. If true, it would mean that Bahina Rivera had confessed to a crime he didn't commit, that he had been wrongly accused and imprisoned for 2 years, and that the real killers had been free this entire time. The defense argued that this new information required a postponement of the trial to investigate these claims thoroughly. The prosecution vehemently opposed the defense motion, arguing that the inmate's claims were not credible and appeared to be an attempt by the defense to create reasonable doubt. They pointed out that the inmate had a lengthy criminal history, that his story had inconsistencies, and that he had only come forward after Bahina Rivera's case had received significant publicity. They argued that there was no physical evidence linking this inmate, or his alleged accomplice, to Molly's death, while there was substantial evidence connecting Bahina Rivera to the crime. Judge Joel Yates faced a difficult decision. On one hand, if there was any possibility that an innocent man was about to be tried for murder, that needed to be investigated. On the other hand, the prosecution had built a strong case against Bahina Rivera, including his confession and his leading investigators to Molly's body. And this last-minute claim from an inmate could simply be a desperate defense tactic. The judge ordered a hearing to examine the credibility of the new claims. The inmate who had come forward was brought to testify, and both the prosecution and defense had the opportunity to question him. During this testimony, significant problems with his story emerged. His timeline didn't match the known facts of the case. Details he provided about Molly's death contradicted the forensic evidence. When pressed for specifics, his account became vague and contradictory. The prosecution presented evidence that the inmate had made similar false claims in other cases, apparently seeking attention or hoping to negotiate better treatment in his own criminal matters. They argued that his story was entirely fabricated and should be disregarded. After considering all the evidence and testimony, Judge Yates ruled that the inmate's claims were not credible and did not warrant postponing or dismissing the charges against Bahena Rivera. The trial would proceed as scheduled. The defense had attempted to create doubt about Bahena Rivera's guilt, but the judge found their new evidence unconvincing. The stage was now set for the trial itself, which was scheduled to begin in May 2021, nearly 3 years after Molly's death. Both sides had spent years preparing for this moment. The prosecution was confident in their case, built on Bahena Rivera's confession, the video evidence of his vehicle, and the fact that he had led investigators to Molly's body. The defense would argue that the confession was false, coerced during a lengthy interrogation of a man who didn't fully understand his rights or the implications of what he was saying. The trial of Christian Bahena Rivera began on May 17, 2021, in Scott County, Iowa. The venue had been moved from Poweshiek County due to concerns about finding an impartial jury in the county where Molly had lived and where the crime had occurred. The case had received such extensive publicity in the Brooklyn area that it would have been nearly impossible to seat a jury of people who hadn't already formed strong opinions about the defendant's guilt or innocence. The courtroom was packed with observers on the first day of trial. Members of Molly's family sat in the front rows, their faces reflecting the mixture of grief, anger, and determination that had sustained them through nearly 3 years of waiting for this moment. Reporters filled much of the gallery, representing local, state, and national media outlets. Members of the public who had followed the case closely had lined up early in the morning hoping to secure seats for what promised to be one of the most closely watched trials in Iowa history. Christian Bahena Rivera sat at the defense table flanked by his attorneys. He wore civilian clothes rather than a jail jumpsuit, a strategic choice by his defense team to make him appear less threatening to the jury. His expression remained largely neutral throughout the proceedings, his dark eyes occasionally scanning the courtroom but showing little emotion. He had the assistance of a Spanish interpreter, as English was not his first language, though he had lived in the United States for several years. The process of jury selection took several days. Potential jurors were questioned extensively about their knowledge of the case, their views on immigration, their ability to be impartial, and their willingness to consider evidence without prejudgment. Both the prosecution and defense exercised their challenges to exclude jurors they felt might be biased against their side. Finally, a jury of 12 people plus alternates was seated, a group of Iowans who would be tasked with determining Bahena Rivera's fate. In his opening statement, Prosecutor Scott Brown laid out the state's case in stark, straightforward terms. He described Molly Tibbetts as a vibrant young woman who had simply gone for a run on a summer evening and never came home. He told the jury about the massive search effort, the FBI investigation, and the breakthrough when investigators identified Bahena Rivera's vehicle on security camera footage in the area where Molly had been jogging. Brown described the interrogation during which Bahena Rivera allegedly confessed to following Molly, becoming angry when she threatened to call police, and ultimately killing her. Most damning of all, Brown told the jury, was that Bahena Rivera had led investigators directly to Molly's body, hidden in a cornfield where it might never have been found otherwise. How would the defendant know where Molly Tibbetts' body was? Brown asked the jury, unless he put it there himself. The prosecutor outlined the physical evidence that would be presented: the video footage of Bahena Rivera's vehicle, the DNA evidence, the autopsy results showing Molly had been stabbed 7 times, and the testimony of investigators who had interviewed Bahena Rivera. He acknowledged that the murder weapon had never been recovered, but argued that the totality of the evidence left no reasonable doubt about Bahena Rivera's guilt. When defense attorney Chad Freeze rose to give his opening statement, he faced the daunting task of explaining away his client's alleged confession and the fact that Bahena Rivera had led police to Molly's body. Freze's strategy was to attack the interrogation itself, arguing that after 11 hours of questioning by experienced investigators, Bahena Rivera, a man with limited English proficiency and no prior experience with the American criminal justice system, had been manipulated into giving a false confession. Freeze told the jury that Bahena Rivera's confession was unreliable and contradictory, that investigators had fed him information about the case, and then claimed he had volunteered it. He argued that the interrogators had used psychological tactics designed to break down Bahena Rivera's resistance and make him tell them what they wanted to hear. He suggested that Bahena Rivera had pointed to a random location on a map when asked where Molly could be found, and that by terrible coincidence or through information that investigators themselves had provided, this happened to be near where her body was actually located. It was a difficult argument to make convincingly, and Freeze knew it. But the defense had little choice. They had to provide the jury with an alternative explanation for the confession, no matter how improbable it might seem. Freeze promised that the defense would present evidence of the coercive interrogation tactics used and would show that Bahena Rivera's statements were neither reliable nor trustworthy. The prosecution began presenting their case by calling witnesses who could establish the timeline of events on July 18, 2018. Dalton Jack, Molly's boyfriend, testified about their relationship and his last communications with her. His voice broke as he described the Snapchat message she had sent him that evening, the last time he heard from her. He told the jury about his growing concern when she didn't respond to his messages the next day, and the terrible moment when he realized something was wrong. Molly's mother, Laura Calderwood, took the stand to describe her daughter's personality, her habits, and her reliability. Through tears, she explained that it was completely unlike Molly to disappear without telling anyone, to miss work, or to ignore her phone. She testified about the agonizing weeks of searching and waiting, not knowing if her daughter was alive or dead. Several jurors wiped away tears as Laura described the moment she learned that Molly had been found, but that she was gone forever. Law enforcement officers testified about the initial missing person investigation, the massive search effort that followed, and the frustration of finding no trace of Molly despite extensive searching. They described the thousands of tips that came in, the interviews they conducted, and the dead ends they encountered. They explained how the case had seemed to go cold until the breakthrough with the video footage. The security camera footage became a crucial element of the prosecution's case. A homeowner testified about the camera system installed on his rural property and the footage it had captured on July 18th. The video, though grainy, clearly showed a black Chevy Malibu driving past multiple times during the period when Molly would have been jogging in that area. The repetitive nature of the vehicle's movements, passing by, turning around, and passing again, suggested someone searching for something or following someone. Investigators testified about the painstaking process of identifying every black Chevy Malibu in the region and tracking down Bahena Rivera's vehicle. They presented evidence showing that the car in the video matched Bahena Rivera's vehicle in multiple specific details, the same model year, similar damage on the body panels, even the same type of decorative item hanging from the rearview mirror. The interrogation of Bahena Rivera became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. The 11-hour interview had been video recorded, and portions of this recording were played for the jury. The footage showed Bahena Rivera in a small interview room, initially appearing calm and cooperative as investigators asked him routine questions about his work and his vehicle. As the interrogation progressed, the video showed the investigators' tactics becoming more aggressive. They confronted Bahena Rivera with the evidence against him, the video footage placing his car in the area, the fact that Molly was missing, the timeline that put him at the scene. They told him that they knew he was involved, that lying would only make things worse, that telling the truth was his only option. For hours, according to the video, Bahina Rivera denied any involvement in Molly's disappearance. He claimed he didn't remember seeing anyone jogging, that he was just driving in the area as part of his normal routine. But the investigators persisted, using techniques designed to break down a suspect's resistance, building rapport, expressing understanding, suggesting ways the crime might have been accidental or justified, and repeatedly returning to the same questions from different angles. The video showed Bahina Rivera becoming increasingly tired and stressed as the hours wore on. At several points, he put his head in his hands or closed his eyes, the exhaustion evident on his face. The investigators gave him minimal breaks, maintaining constant pressure, never allowing him to settle into a comfortable denial of involvement. Then, according to the prosecution's presentation of the interrogation, Bahina Rivera's story began to change. He admitted he had seen Molly jogging. He said he had noticed her because she was attractive. He acknowledged that he had driven past her more than once. And eventually, according to investigators, he confessed to approaching her, to becoming angry when she threatened to call police, and to attacking her. The prosecution played the portion of the video where investigators presented Bahina Rivera with aerial photographs of the area, and asked him to point out where Molly could be found. The video showed Bahina Rivera studying the photographs, initially refusing to point to any location, and then after more pressure from investigators, indicating a spot in a rural area southeast of Brooklyn. Law enforcement officers testified about what happened next. The driving location Bahina Rivera had indicated in the pre-dawn darkness, searching through the cornfield and finding Molly's body exactly where Bahina Rivera had directed them. The officers described the scene: Molly's remains covered with corn stalks, still wearing her running clothes, hidden in a place where she might never have been discovered without Bahina Rivera's information. The testimony about finding Molly's body was devastating for her family members in the courtroom. Laura Calderwood left the courtroom during this portion of the testimony, unable to bear hearing the details of how her daughter had been found. Other family members remained, their faces reflecting the pain of reliving that terrible moment when hope had died and the worst fears had been confirmed. Dr. Dennis Klein, a forensic pathologist, testified about the autopsy he had performed on Molly's remains. He explained that decomposition had made determining exact cause of death challenging, but that he had identified at least 7 sharp force injuries, stab wounds on Molly's body. Some of these wounds were on her hands and arms, defensive injuries consistent with her trying to fight off an attacker. Others were to her torso, including injuries that could have been fatal. The pathologist's testimony painted a horrifying picture of Molly's final moments. She had been stabbed multiple times by someone wielding a sharp, bladed weapon, probably a knife. She had tried to defend herself, raising her hands to ward off the attack, but had been overpowered. The wounds indicated a frenzied, violent attack rather than a single quick strike. Molly had suffered, had fought for her life, and had ultimately lost that terrible fight. Forensic evidence specialists testified about DNA analysis performed on evidence collected from Bahina Rivera's vehicle. They found DNA consistent with Molly's profile in the trunk of the car, supporting the prosecution's theory that Bahina Rivera had transported her body in his vehicle after killing her. The defense challenged the strength of this DNA evidence, arguing that the amounts were minimal and could have been the result of contamination or transfer. But the prosecution maintained it was further proof of Bahina Rivera's guilt. Digital forensics experts testified about cell phone data and GPS information. They explained how Molly's phone had stopped transmitting data at approximately 8:28 p.m. on July 18th, in the area where Bahina Rivera's vehicle had been captured on video. Her Fitbit had stopped recording her run at approximately the same time and location. The convergence of this digital evidence with the video footage and Bahina Rivera's alleged confession created a timeline that the prosecution argued was overwhelming proof of his guilt. As the prosecution's case continued, they called witnesses who could testify about Bahina Rivera's demeanor and behavior in the weeks following Molly's disappearance. Co-workers at Yarrabee Farms testified that Bahina Rivera had seemed normal, showing no signs of stress or guilt as he continued his daily work routine. He had not mentioned Molly's disappearance, or the massive search effort that was ongoing, despite it being the dominant topic of conversation in the community. This testimony was designed to support the prosecution's characterization of Bahena Rivera as someone capable of compartmentalizing his actions, of committing a terrible crime, and then continuing with his life as if nothing had happened. The prosecution argued that this ability to maintain a normal facade while a young woman's body lay hidden in a cornfield demonstrated consciousness of guilt and a disturbing lack of remorse. The prosecution also presented evidence about Bahena Rivera's internet searches in the days and weeks before Molly's disappearance. While they found no smoking gun, no searches specifically about Molly or about how to commit murder, they did find searches related to women and various other topics that they argued showed a pattern of behavior. The defense objected to much of this evidence as irrelevant and potentially prejudicial, but Judge Yates allowed some of it to be presented to the jury. After more than 2 weeks of testimony, the prosecution rested their case. They had presented a narrative that seemed straightforward. Bahena Rivera had seen Molly jogging, had followed her, had approached her, and had killed her when she threatened to call police. He had hidden her body and might never have been caught, if not for the video evidence that identified his vehicle. His own confession and his knowledge of where Molly's body could be found sealed his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Now it was the defense's turn, and they faced a monumental challenge. How could they explain away the confession and the fact that their client had led police to the body? Their strategy would be to attack the interrogation as coercive, and to argue that Bahena Rivera's statements were unreliable. But they also had another card to play, a controversial and unexpected one that would shock the courtroom and generate intense legal debate. When the defense began presenting their case, they called expert witnesses on interrogation techniques and false confessions. Dr. Lawrence White, a psychologist who specializes in studying interrogations, testified about the tactics used by investigators and how they can lead to false confessions, particularly when dealing with suspects who have limited English proficiency or limited understanding of the American legal system. White walked the jury through the psychological techniques visible in the interrogation video: the minimization of the crime, the suggestion that the act might have been accidental or justified, the repeated insistence that lying would only make things worse, and the exhaustion factor of an 11-hour interrogation. He explained how these techniques, while legal, can lead innocent people to confess to crimes they didn't commit, particularly when the suspect is tired, confused, or believes that confessing is the only way to end the interrogation. The defense presented statistics about false confessions, showing that they occur more often than most people realize, particularly in cases involving lengthy interrogations. They argued that Bahena Rivera, facing hour after hour of questioning by experienced investigators, might have simply told them what they wanted to hear in order to end the ordeal, even if it meant confessing to a crime he didn't commit. But the defense's most dramatic moment came when they called Christian Bahena Rivera himself to testify. This was a risky decision. Defendants are not required to testify, and doing so opens them up to cross-examination by the prosecution. But the defense clearly felt that the jury need to hear directly from Bahena Rivera, to see him as a person rather than simply the accused murderer described by prosecutors. Taking the stand through a Spanish interpreter, Bahena Rivera presented a dramatically different version of events than what prosecutors had described. He claimed that his previous confession had been false, coerced by investigators during the lengthy interrogation. He testified that he had been confused, frightened, and exhausted, and that he had told investigators what he thought they wanted to hear. Then Bahena Rivera made a stunning claim. He testified that he had not killed Molly Tibbetts. Instead, he alleged that 2 masked men had abducted Molly at gunpoint while she was jogging, and that these men had forced him at gunpoint to help them dispose of her body. According to this new story, the masked men, while he was in his car, had forced him to help them, and had threatened to harm his family if he ever told anyone what had happened. This testimony was the same theory that the defense had tried to introduce months earlier through the jailhouse informant. a claim that Judge Yates had rejected as not credible. Now Bahena Rivera himself was presenting this story as his defense. He claimed that fear of the masked men had kept him silent during the initial investigation and had led him to confess to a crime he didn't commit during the interrogation. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs as Bahena Rivera told this story. The prosecution team looked incredulous. Molly's family members in the gallery appeared shocked and angry at what they clearly saw as a desperate, last-minute fabrication. Judge Yates called for order as the defense continued to question their client about his allegations. Bahena Rivera testified that after the masked men forced him to help dispose of Molly's body, he had been too frightened to go to police. He claimed he didn't know who the men were but feared they would harm his family if he spoke out. He said that during the interrogation, investigators had showed him photographs of the area and had essentially told him where Molly's body was, and that he had simply confirmed what they already seemed to know. Under cross-examination, Prosecutor Scott Brown systematically dismantled Bahena Rivera's testimony. He pointed out that Bahena Rivera had never mentioned masked men during his initial interrogation, even when investigators were applying pressure and suggesting various scenarios. He noted that Bahena Rivera had provided no description of these alleged masked men, no details about what they looked like, what kind of vehicle they drove, or any other information that could be verified. Brown asked Bahena Rivera why, if he was an innocent victim forced to help dispose of a body, he hadn't contacted police once the alleged masked men were gone. Bahena Rivera claimed he was too afraid, but Brown pressed him. You were afraid for 3 years. You were afraid even after you were arrested and charged with murder. You never thought to mention these masked men who supposedly forced you to participate in this crime. The prosecutor's cross-examination of Christian Bahena Rivera was methodical and devastating. Brown confronted him with the timeline of events, pointing out the inconsistencies between his new story about masked men and the evidence had been presented during the trial. He played portions of the interrogation video where Bahena Rivera had never mentioned being forced by anyone else, where he had described following Molly in his car, where he had admitted to approaching her. Brown asked Bahena Rivera to explain how these mysterious masked men had known exactly where he would be driving on the evening of July 18th. How had they known to target him specifically? How had they known he would be in that rural area at that precise time? Bahena Rivera struggled to provide coherent answers, his story becoming more vague and implausible under questioning. The prosecutor pointed out that if Bahena Rivera had truly been an unwilling participant forced to help dispose of Molly's body, he would have had numerous opportunities to escape or seek help. The alleged masked men couldn't have been watching him constantly for the entire time between Molly's death and his arrest over a month later. Yet Bahena Rivera had gone to work every day, had interacted with dozens of people, had been in public places where he could have easily told someone what had supposedly happened. His explanation that he was too frightened to speak rang hollow when examined against the facts. Brown also challenged Bahena Rivera's claim that investigators had shown him where Molly's body was before he pointed to the location on the map. The prosecutor presented testimony from the investigators who had been in the interrogation room, all of whom stated unequivocally that they had not known where Molly's body was located before Bahena Rivera told them. The entire point of showing him the aerial photographs had been to get him to provide information that only the killer would know. If investigators already knew where Molly Tibbetts' body was, Brown asked, why would they have spent weeks searching thousands of acres of farmland? Why would they have brought in the FBI, organized hundreds of volunteers, used search dogs and helicopters and every resource available to them? Does it make any sense that they would go through all of that if they already knew where she was? Bahena Rivera had no convincing answer. His testimony, which was supposed to provide the jury with an alternative explanation for his confession and his knowledge of where Molly's body was located, instead seemed to many observers to confirm his guilt. The masked men's story appeared to be exactly what the prosecution claimed it was, a desperate last-minute fabrication designed to create reasonable doubt. The defense tried to rehabilitate their client's testimony during redirect examination, but the damage had been done. The jury had seen Bahina Rivera attempt to explain away overwhelming evidence with a story that strained credulity. They had watched him struggle to answer basic questions about the alleged masked men. They had observed him presenting a version of events that he had never mentioned during his initial interrogation, or at any point during the 3 years since his arrest. After Bahina Rivera's testimony concluded, the defense called a few additional witnesses to support their theory of a coerced confession. But the focus of everyone in the courtroom remained on the defendant's implausible story about masked men. Legal experts following the trial noted that putting Bahina Rivera on the stand had been an enormous gamble by the defense, and that gamble appeared to have backfired spectacularly. The prosecution used their rebuttal case to systematically refute the masked men theory. They called FBI agents who testified that they had found no evidence whatsoever of any other individuals being involved in Molly's death. No DNA from unknown persons had been found on Molly's body. No witnesses had reported seeing multiple people in the area. No vehicle associated with unknown suspects had been identified on any security footage. The entire theory existed only in Bahina Rivera's testimony, unsupported by a single piece of physical evidence. Investigators testified that they had thoroughly investigated the jailhouse informant's similar claims about alternative suspects months earlier, and had found those claims to be completely fabricated. They suggested that Bahina Rivera's testimony about masked men was simply a recycling of that discredited story, an attempt to introduce reasonable doubt based on claims that had already been proven false. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, both sides prepared to make their final appeals to the jury. The prosecution felt confident in their case, believing they had proven beyond reasonable doubt that Bahina Rivera had killed Molly Tibbetts. The defense, facing an uphill battle after their client's problematic testimony, would need to convince the jury that reasonable doubt existed despite the confession, the physical evidence, and Bahina Rivera's knowledge of where the body was located. In his closing argument, Prosecutor Scott Brown walked the jury through the evidence one final time. He began with Molly herself, showing photographs of the vibrant young woman who had gone for a run on July 18, 2018, and never came home. He described her family's desperate search, the community's efforts to find her, and the terrible moment when her body was discovered in a cornfield. Brown methodically presented the timeline. The video footage showing Bahina Rivera's vehicle passing multiple times in the area where Molly was jogging. The digital evidence showing Molly's phone and Fitbit stopping at approximately 8:28 p.m. The confession in which Bahina Rivera admitted following Molly and becoming angry when she threatened to call police. And most damningly, Bahina Rivera leading investigators directly to Molly's body. Ladies and gentlemen, Brown told the jury, the defendant would have you believe that this is all just a terrible coincidence, that he was forced by mysterious masked men who have never been seen before or since, that he confessed to a crime he didn't commit and just happened to point investigators to the exact location where Molly Tibbetts' body was hidden, that DNA matching Molly's profile just happened to be in his trunk for some innocent reason. Brown paused, letting the improbability of these claims sink in. But you know what happened. The evidence shows you what happened. Christian Bahina Rivera saw Molly Tibbetts jogging alone on a rural road. He followed her in his vehicle. He approached her, and when she threatened to call police, he became enraged and he stabbed her to death. Then he hid her body in a cornfield and went on with his life, while her family desperately searched for her. The prosecutor addressed the confession head on, knowing the defense would attack it. Was the interrogation long? Yes. Was it difficult for the defendant? Yes, but at no point was he physically harmed, threatened, or denied his rights. He was read his Miranda rights. He was told he could stop talking at any time. He chose to continue. He chose to confess. And he chose to tell investigators where Molly's body was because he knew, because he's the one who put her there. Brown concluded his closing argument by returning to Molly and her family. Molly Tibbetts was 20 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. She was going to be a child psychologist, going to help children who had experienced trauma. She was going to make a difference in the world. But the defendant took all of that away from her. He took her life, he took her future, and he took her from the family who loved her. It's time to hold him accountable for what he did. Find him guilty of first-degree murder. Defense attorney Chad Freeze faced the difficult task of providing the jury with a reason to acquit despite the weight of evidence against his client. His closing argument focused on attacking the reliability of the confession and raising questions about the investigation. Freeze reminded the jury about the psychological pressure applied during the 11-hour interrogation. Imagine being questioned for 11 hours in a language that's not your native language, by experienced investigators trained in techniques designed to break down your resistance. Imagine being told over and over that lying will only make things worse, that confessing is your only option, that they already know you're guilty. How many of us could withstand that kind of pressure without eventually telling them what they want to hear? He pointed to research on false confessions, noting that innocent people do sometimes confess to crimes they didn't commit, particularly under the circumstances Bahena Rivera faced. The investigators didn't find evidence and then confront the defendant with it. They decided he was guilty and then interrogated him until he gave them a confession that matched what they believed happened. Regarding Bahena Rivera's knowledge of where Molly's body was located, Freeze argued that the investigators had inadvertently provided this information during the interrogation by focusing on certain areas on the maps they showed him. They told you they didn't know where Molly was, but they had been searching specific areas. They had theories about where she might be. And during that interrogation, they communicated those theories to my client, consciously or unconsciously. Freeze acknowledged that his client's testimony about masked men had been unexpected and difficult to believe. I know that story is hard to accept, but consider the alternative that my client, a man with no history of violence, no criminal record, randomly decided to commit a brutal murder in broad daylight on a rural road where anyone could have seen him. Which scenario actually makes less sense? It was a valiant effort, but even Freeze seemed to recognize the weakness of his position. The evidence against Bahena Rivera was substantial, and the masked men's story had damaged rather than helped the defense's credibility. As Freeze concluded his argument, urging the jury to find reasonable doubt, there was a sense in the courtroom that the outcome was not really in question. The prosecution had the final word, as is customary in criminal trials. Assistant Prosecutor Scott Brown stood once more before the jury to deliver the state's rebuttal to the defense's closing argument. The defense wants you to believe this is all just a terrible misunderstanding, Brown said. That an innocent man was pressured into confessing to a crime he didn't commit. That he just happened to point to the right location where Molly's body was hidden. That masked men who leave no evidence, who have never been seen, who defy all logic and common sense, are the real killers. Brown shook his head. Ladies and gentlemen, use your common sense. Look at the evidence. The defendant's vehicle was there. His DNA was in the trunk where he transported her body. He confessed to the crime. He knew where the body was. Every single piece of evidence points to one conclusion, and one conclusion only: Christian Bahena Rivera murdered Molly Tibbetts. After closing arguments concluded, Judge Yates instructed the jury on the law they would need to apply in their deliberations. He explained the elements of first-degree murder that the prosecution needed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. He defined reasonable doubt itself, that high standard of proof required in criminal cases. He explained that the jury's verdict must be unanimous. All 12 jurors must agree on the verdict. The jury retired to begin deliberations on May 26, 2021. They would be tasked with reviewing all the evidence presented during the trial, discussing the testimony they had heard, and reaching a unanimous decision about Bahena Rivera's guilt or innocence. The judge, attorneys, defendant, and Molly's family could only wait as 12 strangers decided the outcome of a case that had consumed nearly 3 years. The wait was agonizing for everyone involved. Molly's family gathered in a private room near the courtroom, unable to do anything but wait and hope for justice. Laura Catherwood described the waiting as almost unbearable. After 3 years of waiting for answers, waiting for the investigation, waiting for the trial, Now they waited for 12 people they didn't know to decide whether the man accused of killing their daughter would be held accountable. Bahena Rivera waited in a holding cell, his fate in the hands of the jury. His defense attorneys used the time to discuss what would happen if the jury convicted him, the automatic appeal process, the grounds they might use to challenge the conviction, the long road ahead if the verdict went against them. The prosecution team felt confident but knew that nothing was certain until the jury returned with a verdict. They reviewed their case one more time, mentally preparing for questions the jury might send out during deliberations, ready to respond to any issues that might arise. Hours passed with no word from the jury room. This was not unusual. The jury had weeks of testimony to review, hundreds of pieces of evidence to discuss, and a monumental decision to make. But as the afternoon wore on and evening approached with no verdict, speculation began about what the delay might mean. Were the jurors deadlocked? Was someone holding out for acquittal? Or were they simply being thorough, carefully reviewing everything before reaching their decision? The jury sent out a few questions during their deliberations, asking to review certain pieces of evidence and to have portions of testimony read back to them. Each time a question came out, it sparked new speculation about what it might mean for the verdict. When the jury asked to review the interrogation video again, some saw it as a sign they were carefully consider argument about the confession being coerced. Others thought it meant they wanted to hear Bahena Rivera's own words describing what he had done. As evening turned to night on the first day of deliberations, Judge Yates sent the jury home for the night. They would return the next morning to continue their discussions. The waiting would continue at least one more day. The next morning, May 27, 2021, the jury resumed deliberations. The courthouse filled again with observers, reporters, and family members, everyone waiting for word from the jury room. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew that at any moment, the jury could return with a verdict that would finally bring this long legal process to a conclusion. Around midday, after approximately 8 hours of total deliberation time, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The announcement sent a ripple of activity through the courthouse. Attorneys were summoned. Molly's family was notified and returned to the courtroom. Reporters scrambled to secure their positions. Bahena Rivera was brought from the holding cell to the defense table. Judge Yates took the bench and ordered the jury to be brought in. The 12 men and women who had been tasked with deciding Bahena Rivera's fate filed into the courtroom and took their seats in the jury box. Their faces were serious, reflecting the weight of the decision they had made. None of them looked at the defendant, a sign that experienced courts often interpret as indicating a guilty verdict. The judge asked the foreperson if the jury had reached a unanimous verdict. The foreperson confirmed that they had. The verdict form was handed to a court clerk, who handed it to the judge. Judge Yates reviewed the form to ensure it had been properly completed, then handed it back to the clerk to be read aloud. The courtroom was completely silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the culmination of nearly 3 years of investigation, legal proceedings, and waiting. Molly's mother clutched her husband's hand, her knuckles white with tension. Other family members linked arms, supporting each other as they prepared to hear the verdict. The clerk's voice rang out clearly in the silent courtroom. "We, the jury, find the defendant Christian Bahena Rivera guilty of murder in the first degree." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before their meaning fully registered. Guilty. The jury had unanimously concluded that Bahena Rivera had murdered Molly Tibbetts. In the gallery, Molly's family members embraced, some crying tears of relief that justice had been served. Others simply collapsing under the weight of emotion they had been holding back for years. Bahena Rivera showed little visible reaction to the verdict. His face remained largely expressionless as his attorneys leaned in to speak with him quietly. His fate was now sealed under Iowa law. First-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Judge Yates thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. He set a sentencing date for approximately 2 months later, though the sentence was already predetermined by law. The formal sentencing hearing would provide an opportunity for Molly's family to address the court, and for the judge to officially impose the life sentence. As court was adjourned and Bahina Rivera was led away in handcuffs, Molly's family emerged from the courtroom to face the waiting media. Laura Calderwood, flanked by other family members, made a brief statement to the assembled reporters. "Today, justice was served," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion visible on her face. "Molly can rest now, knowing that the man who took her life will spend the rest of his life in prison. This verdict doesn't bring Molly back to us. Nothing can do that. But it does give us a measure of peace knowing that he will never be able to hurt anyone else's daughter." Rob Tibbetts also spoke, thanking the investigators, prosecutors, and everyone who had worked tirelessly to find Molly and to bring her killer to justice. "This has been the longest 3 years of our lives," he said, "but we never gave up hope that we would get justice for Molly." The jury saw through the lies and the last-minute desperate stories. They saw the truth, that this man murdered our daughter and tried to get away with it. The conviction generated extensive media coverage across the country. News outlets that had followed the case from the beginning reported on the verdict, many including retrospectives on Molly's life, the massive search effort, and the investigation that had led to Bahina Rivera's arrest. Legal analysts discussed the strength of the prosecution's case and the defense's failed strategy of putting Bahina Rivera on the stand to tell his implausible story about masked men. The immigration debate that had swirled around the case from the beginning intensified after the conviction. Politicians and commentators on both sides of the issue renewed their arguments, using the verdict to support their positions on immigration policy. Once again, Molly's family had to endure seeing their daughter's death used for political purposes, a reality that added another layer of pain to their grief. In Brooklyn, Iowa, the community that had been devastated by Molly's disappearance and felt a mixture of relief and continued sadness. The verdict provided some closure, but it didn't erase the trauma of what had happened. The town's innocence had been shattered, and no guilty verdict could restore the sense of complete safety they had once felt. The formal sentencing hearing for Christine Bahina Rivera was scheduled for July 7, 2021. Although the sentence was mandated by law, life in prison without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder, the hearing would provide an opportunity for Molly's family and friends to address the court directly, to speak about the impact of her death, and to confront the man who had taken her from them. In the 2 months between the verdict and sentencing, Bahina Rivera's defense team filed motions for a new trial based on several arguments. They claimed that the trial had been unfair, that evidence had been improperly admitted, and that newly discovered evidence warranted reconsideration of the verdict. Judge Yates scheduled hearings to consider these motions before proceeding with sentencing. The defense's primary argument for a new trial centered on 2 individuals who came forward after the verdict claiming they had information about the case. According to the defense, these individuals provided statements suggesting that someone else had been involved in Molly's death. This was the same basic theory that had been presented during the trial through Bahina Rivera's testimony about masked men, now supposedly corroborated by these new witnesses. The evidentiary hearing on these claims took place in early July 2021. The 2 individuals who had come forward testified about their alleged knowledge of the case. However, under cross-examination by prosecutors, significant problems with their credibility emerged. Their stories were inconsistent with each other and with the established facts of the case. Their timelines didn't match. Details they provided contradicted the physical evidence. Moreover, the prosecution presented evidence that one of these individuals had a significant criminal history and had made similar false claims in other cases. Investigators testified that they had thoroughly examined these new claims and found them to be completely without merit. Nothing more than a continued attempt by the defense to create doubt where none reasonably existed. Judge Yates ultimately ruled that the new claims were not credible and did not warrant a new trial. In a detailed written order, he explained that the evidence against Bahina Rivera had been overwhelming, that the jury had been properly instructed, and that the trial had been fair. He found that the newly presented testimony appeared to be fabricated, and that it would not have changed the outcome, even if it had been presented to the jury during the trial. With the motion for a new trial denied, the case moved forward to the sentencing hearing. On July 27, 2021, the court once again with many of the same faces that had attended the trial. Family members, reporters, law enforcement officers who had worked on the case, and members of the public who had followed Molly's story from the beginning. The sentencing hearing began with victim impact statements, an opportunity for those affected by Molly's death to address the court and the defendant directly. These statements would prove to be some of the most emotionally powerful moments of the entire legal proceedings. Laura Calderwood was the first to speak. She walked to the podium carrying photographs of Molly at various ages, as a baby, as a young girl, as a teenager, and as the beautiful 20-year-old she had been when she was killed. Laura's voice trembled with emotion as she began to speak. "Molly was my baby," she said, tears streaming down her face. "She was my firstborn, my only daughter, my best friend. From the moment she was born, she filled my life with joy and love. She was kind, compassionate, funny, and bright. She had dreams of helping children, of making the world a better place. She had so much to give, so much life to live." Laura described the agony of the 5 weeks when Molly was missing, the desperate hope that she would be found alive, and the devastating moment when that hope died. "Every day I wake up and for just a moment I forget that she's gone, and then reality crashes in and I have to relive the loss all over again. There is a hole in my heart that will never be filled. There are conversations we will never have, milestones we will never celebrate, grandchildren I will never meet." She turned to look directly at Bahina Rivera, who sat at the defense table with his eyes downcast. "You took my daughter from me. You took her future. You took everything she could have been. And for what? Because she told you to leave her alone. Because she threatened to call the police when you were following her. You decided that her life meant nothing, that your anger or your desire was more important than her right to live." Laura's voice grew stronger, fueled by the rage that lay beneath her grief. "I hope you think about what you did every single day for the rest of your life. I hope you see Molly's face when you close your eyes. I hope you never know a moment of peace. Because we never will. We will carry this pain for the rest of our lives because of what you chose to do." She concluded by speaking about Molly's legacy. Molly was nobody's victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman with dreams and plans and so much love to give. That's how we will remember her. Not as the girl who was murdered, but as the girl who lived with joy and kindness and made everyone around her feel special. You took her life, but you can't take her memory or her impact on the world. Rob Tibbett spoke next, his statement focusing on the practical losses, the empty chair at family gatherings, the phone calls that would never come, the future events that Molly would never attend. He described the torture of not knowing where Molly was during those 5 weeks, imagining terrible possibilities, hoping against hope that she would be found alive. "You made us live with that uncertainty, that agony for over a month," Rob said, his voice thick with controlled anger. "You went to work every day, went about your life, while we were desperately searching for our daughter, while her friends were walking through fields calling her name, while her mother was on television begging for her safe return. You knew exactly where she was, and you said nothing." He spoke about the impact of Molly's death on her younger brothers, who had lost their only sister. They will never have her at their weddings. Their children will never know their aunt. She was supposed to be in their lives forever, and you took that away from them. You took that away from all of us. Dalton Jack, Molly's boyfriend, struggled through his statement with visible emotion. He described the life he and Molly had planned together, the conversations they'd had about marriage and children and growing old together. "She was supposed to be my wife," he said, his voice breaking. "We were supposed to build a life together. We talked about what we would name our children, where we would live, what kind of dog we would get. All of those dreams died with her." He spoke about the guilt he carried for not being there when Molly needed him, even though rationally he knew there was nothing he could have done. I should have been there to protect her. That's what keeps me up at night. But you're the one who killed her. You're the one who made the choice to take her life. That guilt belongs to you, not to me." Friends of Molly's spoke about the light she had brought into their lives, the memories they cherished, and the future they had all imagined sharing with her. Several mentioned that they were now afraid to go jogging alone, that Molly's death had stolen their sense of safety and changed how they moved through the world. Molly's younger brothers, though devastated, chose not to speak at the hearing. The family explained that they were still processing their grief and weren't ready to face the man who had killed their sister in such a public forum. Their written statements were submitted to the court instead, describing the profound loss of growing up without the sister who had been their protector and friend. After all the victim impact statements had been delivered, Judge Yates asked Bahena Rivera if he wished to address the court before sentence was imposed. Bahena Rivera stood, speaking through his interpreter, and made a brief statement. "I'm sorry for what happened to Molly Tibbetts," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I did not mean for this to happen. I wish I could take it back." His statement was brief and seemed rehearsed, lacking any genuine emotion or detailed acknowledgement of what he had done. He did not explain what he meant by saying he did not mean for this to happen, or provide any real accounting for his actions. The prosecution saw this statement as further evidence of Bahena Rivera's inability to take genuine responsibility for his crime. He had maintained his innocence throughout the trial, had told an implausible story about masked men, and even now could not bring himself to admit fully what he had done or express genuine remorse for taking Molly's life. Judge Yates then addressed Bahena Rivera directly before imposing sentence. He spoke about the severity of the crime, the impact on Molly's family and community, and the mandatory nature of the sentence he was about to impose. "Mr. Bahena Rivera, a jury of your peers has found you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of the murder of Molly Tibbetts," the judge said. "The evidence presented at trial was overwhelming. You followed Molly Tibbetts while she was jogging, you approached her, and when she exercised her right to reject your advances and threatened to call the police, you stabbed her to death. You then hid her body in a cornfield and went about your life while her family desperately searched for her." Judge Yates continued, his tone stern and uncompromising. "This was a senseless, violent crime that took the life of a promising young woman who had her whole future ahead of her. You have shown no genuine remorse for your actions. You have continued to lie about what happened, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. You have put Molly's family through the additional trauma of a trial where you told implausible stories rather than accepting responsibility for what you did." The judge then formally imposed the mandatory sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Bahena Rivera would spend the rest of his life behind bars, never to be released, never to know freedom again. He would grow old in prison, would die in prison, would never have the opportunity to rebuild a life outside prison walls. "This sentence ensures that you will never have the opportunity to harm anyone else," Judge Yates concluded. "Molly Tibbetts was 20 years old when you took her life. You were 24. Molly will be forever 20, frozen in time at the moment you killed her. You will live with what you have done for the rest of your natural life." Bahena Rivera showed little reaction as the sentence was imposed. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs and leg shackles, transported back to jail to await transfer to a state prison where he would serve his life sentence. As he was led away, several of Molly's family members watched him go, their faces reflecting a mixture of satisfaction that justice had been served and the ongoing pain of a loss that no sentence could truly address. Outside the courthouse, prosecutors held a press conference to discuss the conclusion of the case. They praised the work of law enforcement agencies that had investigated Molly's disappearance and death, noting that the case had required thousands of hours of work by dozens of investigators. They thanked Molly's family for their patience and strength throughout the long legal process. "This case represents the very best of law enforcement cooperation and dedication," Prosecutor Scott Brown said. "From the local sheriff's deputies who responded to the initial missing person report, To the FBI agents who brought national resources to bear, to the crime scene technicians who processed evidence, everyone involved was committed to finding Molly and bringing her killer to justice. Today's sentence represents the culmination of their efforts. Brown also addressed the politicization of the case, echoing the sentiments that Molly's family had expressed throughout the proceedings. This case should never have been about immigration policy or political debates. It should be about Molly Tibbetts, about who she was, what she represented, and the terrible loss her death represents to everyone who knew and loved her. We hope that now, with the legal proceedings concluded, Molly's family can begin the long process of healing. The FBI released a statement commending the work of all the agencies involved in the investigation and expressing sympathy for Molly's family. The statement noted that the case had required an unprecedented level of cooperation between local, state, and federal agencies, and that the successful prosecution demonstrated the effectiveness of such collaboration. In Brooklyn, Iowa, the community held a memorial service for Molly now that the legal proceedings had finally concluded. The service was attended by hundreds of people who had known Molly, who had searched for her, who had followed her case, and who wanted to honor her memory. The emphasis was entirely on celebrating Molly's life, rather than focusing on her death or her killer. Stories were shared about Molly's kindness, her sense of humor, her love for animals, and her dedication to helping others. Former teachers spoke about her as a student, describing her intelligence and her genuine interest in learning. Children from the daycare where she had worked drew pictures and made cards expressing how much they had loved Miss Molly. Friends from the University of Iowa performed songs that Molly had loved, despite their tears making it difficult to get through the lyrics. The community announced the establishment of the Molly Tibbetts Memorial Scholarship, which would be awarded annually to students from the Brooklyn area pursuing degrees in psychology, social work, or related fields focused on helping children. The scholarship would ensure that Molly's dream of helping traumatized children would live on through other students who shared her passion and dedication. A memorial was created in Brooklyn featuring a bench overlooking the football field where Molly had spent so many Friday nights cheering on her classmates. The bench bore a plaque with Molly's name, her dates of birth and death, and a quote she had once written in a school essay: "Kinness is the bridge between our hearts." The memorial became a place where community members could go to remember Molly, to sit quietly and reflect, and to honor the impact she had made during her 20 years of life. The University of Iowa also created a permanent memorial to Molly on campus, a quiet garden space where students could go to study, reflect, or simply find peace. The memorial included information about resources available to students concerned about their safety, reflecting the university's commitment to ensuring that Molly's death would lead to increased awareness and prevention efforts. In the months following the sentencing, Molly's family began the difficult work of trying to rebuild their lives while carrying the weight of their loss. Laura Calderwood became an advocate for missing persons cases and victims' families, working with organizations to support other families going through the trauma of having a loved one disappear. She channeled her grief into helping others, finding some measure of purpose in ensuring that other families received the support and resources they needed. Rob Tibbetts focused on preserving Molly's memory and supporting her brothers as they navigated young adulthood without their sister. The family established traditions to honor Molly, releasing balloons on her birthday, gathering on the anniversary of her death to share memories and support each other, and ensuring that she remained a present part of their family narrative, rather than someone they avoided discussing because it was too painful. Dalton Jack struggled profoundly with Molly's death. The future he had envisioned with her was gone, and finding a new path forward proved extraordinarily difficult. Friends and family rallied around him, providing support as he worked through his grief and guilt. He eventually became involved in the scholarship fund established in Molly's name, finding some solace in helping to fulfill the dreams she had held for helping others. Christian Bahina Rivera was transferred to the Iowa State Penitentiary to begin serving his life sentence. His case would automatically be appealed to the Iowa Supreme Court, as all first-degree murder convictions are in Iowa. But legal experts believed the appeal had little chance of success, given the strength of the evidence and the thoroughness in the trial proceedings. In prison, Bahena Rivera would be housed in a maximum security facility, his days structured by the rigid routine of prison life. He would wake at the same time every day, eat meals at prescribed times, have limited recreational opportunities, and spend the vast majority of his time in confinement. Unlike Molly, who would never have the chance to pursue her dreams or build the life she had imagined, Bahena Rivera would have decades of life ahead of him, but all of it would be lived within prison walls. The case had lasting impacts beyond just Molly's family and community. It sparked conversations about safety for women jogging or exercising alone, leading to increased awareness and the development of safety apps and devices designed to help women stay safe while exercising outdoors. Running groups began organizing group runs specifically to ensure that no one had to run alone if they felt unsafe doing so. The case also highlighted the challenges of investigating missing persons cases in rural areas, where vast distances and limited law enforcement resources can make searches extremely difficult. It demonstrated the importance of security camera systems, even in rural areas, and the value of community cooperation in providing information to investigators. The immigration aspects of the case continued to generate debate and discussion long after the trial concluded. Some argue that the case demonstrated failures in immigration enforcement that had allowed Bahena Rivera to remain in the country despite his undocumented status. Others countered that focusing on immigration missed the larger point, that violence against women is a societal problem that crosses all demographic boundaries, and that the vast majority of immigrants, regardless of legal status, are not criminals. Molly's family consistently pushed back against efforts to use her death for political purposes. They emphasized that Molly had been a compassionate, open-minded person who would not have wanted her death used to promote hatred or division. They argued that the focus should be on remembering Molly for who she was and working to prevent violence against women, rather than using her case to advance political agendas. As years passed, the intense media attention on the case faded, but for Molly's family, the loss remained as acute as ever. They learned to live with their grief, to find moments of joy and meaning despite the hole in their hearts, but Molly's absence was a constant presence in their lives. Every family gathering was missing one essential person. Every holiday carried the pain of her loss. Every milestone, graduations, weddings, births, was bittersweet, celebrated with joy but shadowed by the knowledge that Molly should have been there to share in these moments. The community of Brooklyn, Iowa, was forever changed by what had happened. The innocence and sense of complete safety that had characterized the small town was replaced by a more realistic understanding that tragedy can strike anywhere. But the community also demonstrated remarkable resilience, coming together to support Molly's family, to honor her memory, and to ensure that she would never be forgotten. The case of Molly Tibbetts stands as a tragic reminder of the vulnerability that women face, even in seemingly safe circumstances, even while engaged in ordinary activities like going for a run. It demonstrates how quickly a normal evening can turn into a nightmare, how a routine activity can become a fatal encounter with evil. But Molly's story is about more than her death. It's about the 20 years she lived with kindness, compassion, and joy. It's about the dreams she held for making a difference in the world, even if she never got the chance to fully realize them. It's about the impact one person can have on a community, on a family, on the countless people whose lives she touched during her brief time on Earth. In the end, Molly Tibbetts was not defined by how she died, but by how she lived. She was a beloved daughter, sister, girlfriend, and community member. She was a young woman with intelligence, ambition, and a genuine care for others. She was someone who made the world brighter simply by being in it. The world lost something precious when Molly was killed. Her family lost their daughter and sister. Her community lost one of their own. Society lost a future child psychologist who might have helped countless children heal and thrive. All of that potential, all of that promise, was stolen in a moment of violence on a quiet rural road in Iowa, Justice was served when Christian Bahina Rivera was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. But justice, while necessary and important, cannot restore what was taken. It cannot bring Molly back to her family. It cannot give her the future she deserved. It can only ensure that the person responsible for taking her life will never have the opportunity to harm anyone else. How could someone do this? How could a person see a young woman jogging and make the decision to follow her, to approach her, to kill her when she rejected his advances? These questions haunted investigators, prosecutors, and everyone who followed the case. The psychology of such violence, the capacity for one human being to extinguish another's life so callously, remains difficult to comprehend. The world still struggles to understand this level of cruelty, this complete disregard for another person's humanity and right to exist. This case reminds us that evil can hide in plain sight, that danger can come from the most unexpected sources, that someone living and working in a community can harbor terrible capacity for violence that gives no outward warning. But perhaps more importantly, this case reminds us to cherish the people we love, to appreciate the time we have with them, and to never take for granted that they will always be there. Molly's family had no warning that the evening of July 18, 2018, would be the last time they would see her alive. They had no opportunity to say a proper goodbye, to tell her one more time how much they loved her, to prepare for the loss they would endure. Thank you for listening. If you found this case meaningful, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to hear more stories. Good night and stay safe.